It's kind of appropriate that this being Holy Week for Christians among us, that we be looking at the issue of vernacular literature, specifically the writings of Dante di Alighieri and Giovanni Boccaccio, two Italians in the 14th century who together sort of changed the world of literature. So I've moved from the study into my kitchen, so you can see some of the things that we mean when we say vernacular means real people and real lives. Now, I live in a fancy kitchen. My husband's an interior designer. There's the olive oil. There's leftovers from last night. But you can see the coffee cups that we've left out. Here's my my little reading corner. So here's some art that I made over the winter, trying to deal with the pandemic weirdness. A real live living room and a kitchen table. The stuff, the corners of my real life, the world that I live in when I'm not with all of you on campus. The vernacular world. And vernacular means of the people. So one of the great major changes in this drama of world literature that we've been looking at is the change in writing from a classical, high-level, learned language to writing that is at the level of real people, real speech, and real sound. So when we talk about a vernacular language is the language that people actually speak. And up until the 14th century, up until late 1200s, 1300s, anything that was written, any literature that was written in a scholarly language. In the West, it would have been Greek or Latin, primarily Latin throughout the early years of the 10s, 11s, 12s. Greeks happened way earlier. So it was kind of, at the time of Jesus of Nazareth, of Greek koine, a version of Greek, was the language that people communicated in with trade, but every little community, the little communities in what's now Syria, the communities of North Africa, the communities of the southern boot of it, they all had their own languages, their own unique dialects that they used inside with each other. In the 100s, as the Roman Empire spread, one of the great achievements of the wild Roman expansion through the 2s and 3s and 4s and 500s of the Roman Empire at its height was the use of Latin, of literary or scholarly Latin as an administrative language, as a language of authority and authorship, and that continued all the way through the first millennia in the West. So by the time we get to what we call the early Middle Ages, or the years of 1200, of 1300, of 1400, we're still in a time where the Latin of the Church, the Latin of Roman authority, is the primary administrative, poetic, and written language. And then someplace around the ends of the 12s, as we go into 1300, Dante does this amazing thing. He writes this elaborate, extensive, magnificent poem, but rather than writing it in Latin, in the learned language of the authority, he writes it in Italian, in a Florentine dialect that's like what people actually speak. And wow, this blew everybody's mind. They had never seen a text written in a language that was spoken. They'd never seen a text that was written in the language of their mom or their dad. And so that was a huge shift in the history of writing, in the history of literature, to write down words now that people would actually speak. Now, Dante still used a verse form. He used a verse form terza rima, and so the Commedia, the Divine Comedy, is written as a poem. So he's still structuring in Italian language. He's still versifying Italian language, as we had seen versification in Latin. Rhyme scheme, and it's a very complicated rhyme scheme. It's written in 3 lines, terza rima, and the first and the third line rhyme, and the second line becomes the first rhyme sound of the next stanza. So you can look in, if you're interested in hearing the terza rima and learning more about Dante specifically, you can look in the extras this week. I put a couple Dante lectures there, and in them I read a little bit of the Dante, so you can get a sense of how that wonderful rhyme scheme works. But for our purposes this week, we're going to spend more time with Dante's successor, Giovanni Boccaccio, and we're going to look at Boccaccio because of COVID. Or rather, we're going to look at Boccaccio just because, I love both texts. I'm a little more familiar with Dante, but Boccaccio is so interesting to us now because hopefully we're coming out of this weird year of disease, this weird year of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so was Boccaccio. Boccaccio was just a little bit younger than Dante, very aware of Dante from a similar part of Italy. And in 1348, we think there was a pretty significant bout of bubonic plague. The plague would hit cities, people would die, and it was a horrible time of fear, of death, of all kinds of misery. They didn't understand disease. We had no microbiology at that point. They couldn't control. They sort of had some sense of cause and effect. They noticed that the plague spread. They noticed that it was worse in town than it was. And so what happened so they weren't completely irrational. And there's a lot of cause and effect that the medievals and the classic periods had in early theories of medicine and disease. So they weren't completely irrational, but they didn't have the sophisticated microbiological understanding of